Hi, everyone. My name is Ricky Jennings, and I'm the Chief Nursing Informatics Officer at Zebra's North America Healthcare team. I'd like to thank you for joining today and welcome you to our webinar, Connecting the Dots, the Impact of Healthcare Supply Chain on the Patient Care Experience. Prior to starting, I'd like to remind you that all attendees are in listen-only mode. And to ask questions, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. The chat feature will not be available during this time, so please utilize that Q&A tab. We'll address all questions at the conclusion of this webinar. Additionally, we will record this session and send it out at the close of the webinar as well. Today's webinar is a joint presentation created in partnership between Zebra Technologies, Barcodes, and Christus Health. We'll discuss the value of optimizing clinical supply chain workflows and truly their downstream impact on patient care. Joined today by a panel of experts, and I'm excited to introduce you to this group. First, we've got John Worthen, who joins us as industry principal from Zebra Technologies. John has over 30 years of experience in logistics, starting off as a clinician and transforming to his work today, where he works day in and day out with multiple customers as they optimize and innovate for the future. Additionally, Steve Bino, Director of Healthcare and Field Sales at Barcodes, joined us. Steve has over 15 years of experience in leading teams that support customer objectives. He's in his 6th year of leading the team that supports Barcodes healthcare clients. Additionally, we've got Kurt Evans, Director of Infor ERP Systems and Supply Chain Management here with Christus Health. Since joining Christus in 2012, Kurt has held multiple positions within supply chain, ranging from an interim master analyst to an operations and logistics manager, partnering with the hospitals, providing at-the-elbow support and identifying process improvement opportunities, which led to his current role here as Director for Infor Services for Supply Chain. He has 2 separate teams responsible for maintaining Infor for supply chain and an MDM team that is responsible for maintaining and itemizing contract data for all of Christus Health. And lastly, but certainly not least, and thank you so much, we've got Susan Putska, Director for Infor ERP Services, Technical, Christus Health, and she's also a registered nurse. Susan has over 42 years of experience in healthcare industry, both as a clinician and in the shared services space of ERP, Infor systems, technical and information management for large multi-state health systems, with the focus on acute, ambulatory, and international services, as well as facilities. Thank you all for joining us today. I'm eager for you to share your experience with the audience. And before we dig into the conversation, maybe let's take a few minutes. Let's set the stage and share about our individual vantage points on this discussion in healthcare, both today and in the future. Zebra, our vision is to leverage the visible and connected solutions in today's environment. We're supporting critical workflows and transforming the experiences both for users as well as patients. All of this intended at delivering better outcomes by ensuring that all clinical assets and healthcare workers are truly visible, connected, and a lot about what we're talking today, optimally utilized. In recent research, we interviewed hospital leaderships across clinical and IT roles, as well as procurement functions from across the globe to better understand their attitudes towards technology adoption and the role technology will play in the healthcare environment today and in the future. As technology does improve the quality of care and better meet patient expectations, the right collaboration tools become essential to connecting the entirety of the workforce, bringing all of those critical people directly to the patient. In our global study, it really did become clear that reimagining the supply chain and directly linking it to downstream workflows like clinical patient care is essential, both now as a top priority, as well as what's on the horizon for the future. Steve, can you tell us a little bit about Barcodes?
Yeah, thank you, Ricky. We are Barcodes, Inc. We are the largest Zebra partner that offers a full life cycle support and management, so our clients know they have a partner from design and testing into deployment and throughout the full life cycle of the device solution. We have a robust team of experts at our clients' disposal. We have extensive experience integrating on all leading platforms. We have deployed solutions throughout all areas of the hospital: supply chain, laboratory, clinical. Related to today's focus, we have hundreds of supply chain specific deployments. We have strategic healthcare ISV relationships and partnerships. Again, on the supply chain side, we are the official mobility hardware integrator for both Infor MSCM, formerly Lawson, and Workday Supply Chain Management. In addition to the value that we provide via our account managers, technical experts, solution architects, and lifecycle support team members, we found a great amount of synergy when we have tight alignment and engagement with all stakeholders in a solution, including the software and implementation partners. We have several key relationships in the software and consultant space that help drive these synergies. We work side by side with both our clients and the consultants on device setup and configuration testing. They, of course, have their objectives and deliverables. We're there to make sure things go smoothly related to the hardware integration. We can set up the initial test handheld and a Barcodes hosted MDM instance, which enables the implementation consultant to streamline the handheld client integration, testing, debugging process. Look, it's technology, curveballs are going to happen. We're there to assist and streamline when they do.
I think we'll talk about that later. Hold that thought.
Yeah. I mentioned earlier we have solutions across the hospital. This is a nice visual of that. I won't go through the full list that you can see on the screen here, but I will call out a few solutions. Asset tracking gives location visibility to key assets that can greatly reduce patient wait times, reduce theft and loss, ensure equipment is being used as intended. Patient verification, medication administration. We know everything our healthcare clients do is about the patient's health and safety. All of our solutions are aligned with that mission. Certainly this solution is at the forefront of that. The focus of today's call, of course, is inventory management, supply chain management. And with that, I'm going to hand off to Kurt to discuss Christus Health supply chain management initiatives.
Great. Thanks, Steve.
You bet.
And thank you, Ricky, and everybody for allowing me to join today's conversation. So a little bit about who Christus is. We're an international Catholic not-for-profit health system currently located in 3 countries beyond our domestic health centers, which are right now in Texas, Arkansas, New Mexico, and Texas. So sharing just a few quick numbers to who Christus is and some of the data that we have to manage in relation to supply chain. We currently maintain an item master of over 165,000 items, which then translates to over 287,000 actively maintained stock and power item locations across our domestic hospitals alone. All of which are independent of or dependent on the additional 4,500 supply contracts that have to be maintained associated with those supplies. This does not factor into the supply chain management for clinics who primarily utilize our punch-out process to acquire their supply. Our current total assets, leased as of 2022, is reported at $8.9 billion.
Wow. With $8.9 billion worth of assets, Kurt, I think that sets the stage on digging in to learn more about your implementation, how you've optimized your supply chain. Maybe could you just take a couple minutes to set up what launched your initiative? What did you start? What were you looking to solve?
Yeah, so I think there are a number of things, right? Anytime you take on an initiative like this, it's not for a singular purpose. There's multiple purposes. So I think time limited to this conversation, there wouldn't be time to go through everything, but focusing on the supply side, of course, a huge piece of that was really around the visibility. How do we have clear line of sight to understand who has what supply, how is it being processed? If one ministry runs low of a supply, how do they know which friend to phone to see if they need to borrow some of that supply themselves? And historically, that was one of the challenges. There was a lot of silos between our different regions and inability to see cross borders, if you will, outside of my own brick and mortar 4 walls. And so that was one big piece. Another piece was related to really trying to drive some of the flexibility. So how do we become more agile?
I think that's really exciting. And you started this project back in 2019, almost really kind of ahead of the curve before the world you had a realization of the criticality of this space and its impact. Could you tell us a little bit about over the last 4+ years, what outcomes have you seen since addressing these challenges and adopting the solutions?
Yeah, so I mean, there's been a number of outcomes for certain. I would say one has been beyond just the visibility, but creating that standardization, creating the if you want to call, we call a one Christus mentality. It's how do we create an environment where I can walk into any door and effectively the process is going to be the same or very similar, working in the same type of a platform on the same understanding of here's what I'm going to expect and here's what I'm going to see. And so getting that standardization has been monumental in driving that. There's been pieces of, how do we receive supply and what is the location of PAR versus a perpetual inventory? There were things that it depended on which building you walked into where the definition would change. And I can even think back going to prior to our go live and part of our whole design sessions, the conversation was, well, how do you do? And then fill in the blank. And the word that I'll say that I used probably the most of the time was depends. It depends. Where are we talking? Are we talking in Texas or Louisiana? Are we talking which hospital? Each one would function a little bit different. And so I think having gone through the Infor implementation and the integrations, that depends has dwindled. I don't need to utilize, thankfully. Depends as much as I used to back in 2019.
Standardization certainly has its value, but it absolutely doesn't come easy. And I'm certain those have positively impacted your operations, being able to limit how much you say depends or varies or have to have those unique one-off conversations. Susan, from your unique perspective, since implementing in 2019, how have you seen this initiative impact the patient experience or maybe the clinical care experience?
Sure. Thanks, Ricky. I think that's very important that we understand from a clinical leadership perspective that we have to engage with our supply chain management team members. Standardization is not an easy task. It's usually driven by best practices is drive it by consensus instead of majority. And sometimes getting to that consensus when people expect a majority is a hard task. But engagement by that clinical leader of those departments is important so that they have confidence that the supplies that are needed for their clinicians at the point of care are available in the right quantity, the right amount, and the right product. So I can't underemphasize the engagement. It's very critical.
Absolutely. I mean, what I start to hear as a clinician myself is the reliability. And reliability starts to build trust and then starts to positively impact your adoption rates and your outcomes. And it certainly sounds like those are some of the things that made a difference in your implementation, standardizing across your entirety of your health system, despite how many times you had to say it depends between its organization, by bringing the right people to the table. Now, this all sounds perfect. Clearly, you had all the right places in place, you had the right objectives, but those of us on the line, we've been involved in technology, we've been involved in big initiatives, and we know it usually doesn't go completely according to plan. I have to ask this question, and people have got to know, what should they be looking for? What are the potholes? Maybe, Kurt, can I ask you to start with sharing, what were the challenges? What did you run into that was something unexpected as you either kicked off the project or somewhere in the middle?
Yeah, thank you. I think there was obviously more than a few, if being candid, but focusing on a couple. I think one of the biggest challenges that we probably ran into, and it's a very broad statement, but it applies to pretty much everything, is around the communication aspect. Not a revolutionary response here, but it's a core critical component is around that communication piece. Have we communicated with everybody? Do they understand what this means for them and really what's even in it for them? It's easy enough to say, here's the new process, but if somebody doesn't understand or hasn't been clearly communicated with why we're transitioning, it is, well, we've always done it this way mentality. And as a human, we're all human. I think we all kind of get stuck in that at some point. And so being able to define, here's how I make your life better, easier, faster, more efficient, have better visibility, whatever it happens to be for that individual, for that department, whether they be clinical or supply chain, is making sure that we've got the communication that helps to demonstrate that. I think back to a sample, a conversation that probably should have been handled a little differently, and it stemmed around the communication piece, and the expectations of one associate versus another were different, and the understandings were not clearly defined. And so when we first went live with this particular region, there were some unexpected challenges. Our supplies don't exist. We can't find our items. Where do they, and a whole bunch of things, right? And so there was an expectation that the local supply team was communicating with the local clinical team, only to find out after the fact, of course, that actually hadn't transpired. And so the clinicians weren't able to find their supply. And so there were some obvious delays and some urgent builds and setup needed. But we address it and we roll with it and we learn. And that's the core piece to this is learning as we go.
I think we shared this as we prepare, but hindsight's always 2020. So you look back on how you managed it, but of course there's always a challenge. And Susan, talking both languages, clinical and IT, knowing the objectives, from your perspective, was there another gotcha? Did you run into a pothole somewhere?
I think like almost every implementation, one of the things that the clinician user and the supply chain user need to realize is that technology augments a workflow process. It doesn't improve an inefficient workflow process. So you have to look at not just the technology, but you have to look at your business processes and how to have that technology augment that workflow and make it better, more streamlined, less labor intensive on our clinical users so they can get the supplies that they need in a timely manner, how they need it, where they need it, and not have to worry next time they go back. Because if you can't do that, then clinicians by nature will take what they need, stash it away somewhere. It's called hide and hoard, or hoard and hide. And then they'll have it when they need it. And that's not the best methodology in being a good stewards of your resources at your organizations to guarantee that they're going to have confidence in the system that their supplies will be there when they need them. Setting up those par levels, working with those inventories, the perpetual inventory versus a par level, and having that identified up front, and how you're going to manage even things in cath lab or operating room that are consignment items too. That has to be taken into consideration, and that whole process needs to be considered, and that clinical leader needs to engage and be part of that. Otherwise, decisions will be made on their behalf. And as a clinical leader, we don't want that. We want to be engaged. We just have to find the time to partner with your supply chain people, know who they are, because it's not uncommon for us to find out that the two don't know each other and they work in the same building.
Yep.
So back to Kurt's communication, but I want to emphasize engagement.
Communication, engagement, and in fact, I think a line we shared as we were talking about this, and it stuck with me, is that good technology won't solve a bad workflow. So opening those channels of communication, making sure that stakeholders involved and that the two are speaking the same language when you do, absolutely seems like a way to avoid those challenges that will come up, or at least maybe it's more of a solution to navigate through them. Now, John and Steve, I've got to call you in to ask to give perspective here, because you engage with customers and clients across the country as they do this. Maybe John, from your perspective, you've heard here from Christus on challenges and outcomes they've seen. From your perspective, what should an organization consider or be prepared for or to navigate through as they look at optimizing their supply chain workflows?
Well, I think, I love this space, so thank you for the opportunity to be here. But I started my career as a medic in the Air Force. So I was a hospital medic, and then I went into medical logistics. So I've kind of been in both worlds, but at the end of the day, it's about patient outcomes, and we want to make sure our healthcare workers can deliver the best care possible. And our healthcare workers are very resourceful. So that's kind of where the hoarding comes in, to make sure that they have the right assets, at the right time. And that's what, they're trying to do. So I really applaud what Christus and Barcodes has done, is really helped to build that trust. Because it's really a team sport, right? It's making sure that relationship is there and that commitment is there, that the healthcare workers can, rely that the right products will be there. I always talk across, different verticals are 4 R's. It's, the right asset in the right location at the right time in the right condition. And I think that's where, our technology is really going to, is making sure that those are all all there in, providing information when they're not, so that we can work those issues proactively.
Being able to be remotely visible, to have a solution that's transparent as it gets adopted into a workflow. I like the 4 R's with that too. And now I'm going to kind of earmark that conversation on the clinician and allow Steve to share a little on perspective for that anybody who's looking to take on this initiative, or maybe you have, or you're planning your next step, what to consider, what challenges to prepare for.
Yeah, so there's been a lot of talk around communication. I mentioned stakeholder alignment earlier. There are stakeholders within your own organization. I know Kurt mentioned some of that they work through on their end. But remember, there's multiple stakeholder entities within every solution, right? You have a software application, you have your hospital, of course, but you may have a software consultant, implementation consultant, you have a value-added partner, there are a manufacturer of any hardware that's part of a solution. So there's a lot of different entities, right? And so it's very important that all of those stakeholders, all of the parts of that solution have engagement with each other and are part of the conversation in the whole holistic solution. In the particular case of Christus Health, there was great alignment between Christus Health, Barcodes, Zebra, Infor, software consultants, implementation consultants. Things can get pretty disjointed if there isn't regular communication and engagement. The alignment we had absolutely aided as we did overcome. We encountered some challenges and overcame them. One example, Christus Health ran into some issues during some overnight shifts. It was always during the overnight shifts. It was a little quirky, interesting. It was just during the overnight shifts. There were issues that had started to happen. We collaborated with the software partner and consultant. We executed on an overnight troubleshooting session. During that session, a bug was discovered. Infor addressed it, and we moved on, right? And so again, that happened, fairly smoothly. Certainly, Kurt, you could call me out if you agree or disagree with that, but I think fairly smoothly because there was that alignment.
Yeah, and I would agree. I would agree with you on that, Steve. I'm sorry, Ricky, to interject there, but I would agree. On that whole alignment piece between ourselves and Barcodes and Zebra and everybody else is, for the fact that I don't remember all the details of that, it didn't burn itself into my memory for all time, and therefore, obviously, the resolution was good and it was expedient and well managed.
Well, and healthcare is a 24/7 by 365 operation. You do have to have that agility to look at workflows. Maybe there is a depends between a day shift and a night shift, but having the right stakeholders at the place help you kind of navigate those gotchas or prepare in instances. I think that starts to lead to, why are we all doing this? Why do you have them at the table? Where does it downstream to impact somebody to get the workforce to adopt the solution that really is targeted at both creating efficiencies, but being mindful of spend. And in today's environment, which we don't have time in this one session to talk about the complexities or the challenges that healthcare as a market is facing, but what we want to talk about is the solutions to navigate through. And in supply chain, you've got a significant opportunity to positively impact the financial outlooks of it. You can't do that if you're making siloed decisions. And I think that's the root of what we're discussing here, is that you can have a really great solution and a really great plan, but if you don't have everybody at the right table moving towards those targeted outcomes together, you're just not going to see your success. And probably, Susan, I'm going to come back to you. And I think we've talked about the clinician and some of the things that they should know. However, when we're talking about really being successful, really getting the buy-in, really overcoming challenging habits that I struggle to say about our, colleagues, those things like hoarding and hiding, which is only really done to make sure they can do their job effectively when it matters. Susan, from your perspective, if there was one takeaway for clinicians listening or those who are going to help clinicians adopt this, what do they need to know about supply chain?
I think above and beyond what we've already talked about, one of the things that we haven't mentioned yet is it's important to come up with the nomenclature or the naming of that supply. A supply chain team member is going to call it one thing and a clinician's going to call it another. So using those alias names in your software solution, it should have the ability to do that so that both perspectives, both subject matter experts from both perspectives can see what they're getting, what they intend to get. Standardization of supplies, again, which is really difficult, but it brings such stewardship value to your organization. And then focusing back on what Steve said, I was reflecting as he was talking. Christus has a philosophy that when we engage with vendors for solutions to help our healthcare ministries, we make sure that we look for someone who's a good partner. So this webinar to me highlights that aspect of the partnership between Christus Health, Zebra, and Barcodes. And I think that's important because they have been engaged with us and they've been on calls working with our users who are telling them what the problems are, and they're listening. It's just not me at a corporate shared services division in Irving, Texas. Someone from Louisiana is talking about what their problems and the challenges that they're having, and they're being very responsive to those needs. But if the clinician at the leadership level doesn't get involved, or at least their designee is not involved, decisions will be made without you. And you want to be part of this solution because you want to have confidence that your clinicians are going to have the supplies that they need, the type of supply that they need, when and where they have it. We all know that and I'm going to talk briefly on it now, and I think it comes up again later, the pandemic changed our world, the whole world, both professionally and personally. And we know that supplies were very difficult to find at that time. And if you could find them, you couldn't get them shipped to you. And the supply chain team members did a heroic effort and was able to find supplies from places that we never had bought supplies from before, and substitution for supplies that we've never had bought before. When PPE was unavailable, sometimes a raincoat would work. And it really got that significant at some point. It didn't last as long as it sounded like it lasted on the national news, but everybody was struggling. And so engagement and working with those people, knowing who your supply chain team members are, not only supply chain members are, knowing who your stakeholders are in clinical leadership. Can't underestimate that.
Well, Susan, first and foremost, to thank you for your partnership, and absolutely agree with the importance of what you're sharing about our clinical colleagues knowing the right folks, and inversely, those in supply chain crossing that bridge and making sure that the right stakeholders are involved. Absolutely. I'm glad you mentioned the pandemic, and clearly would be remiss not to mention its transformation. And truly, it highlighted some of our blind spots between in supply chain or its relation to operations, because in an instant, everyone in the world needed to know where their assets were, how many they had, being able to move them between organizations wherever the need was greatest. And it was a challenge. So a kudos to you and your organization for the forward thinking, to be prepared, to be able to shift those needs. One of the conversations we had going into this was talking about the concept of systemness, as I stumble over the word, systemness, that health care organizations are talking about today, not seeing themselves as a singular hospital or a singular department, but really as a collective group, and then managing their assets, whether it is medical equipment, soft supplies, and even team members from an entire system outlook. And this is why it's so important to be having this conversation from an interdisciplinary approach. And I think that starts to lead a little into what's the art of the possible? What's the future of supply chain, and what's next? I want to serve this up to everybody on the line here to give their 2 cents on if they were to look in their crystal ball. Here's the challenge. But Kurt, if I could toss this crystal ball to you first and ask you, as you look in there, what's your future at Christus for supply chain? What's next?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a fantastic question, and sometimes the crystal ball works out and sometimes it's a little foggy, and so we have to clean it off a bit here. So I'll do my best to polish it up here, but I'll speak to a little bit of what we're currently working on or engaged with in partnership, with Infor and others. But one of which topmost is recall management, and so the recall management is really around how do we how do we better manage? How do we simplify? How do we get an answer, a solution around supply that's maybe been recalled for whatever reason it's been recalled, and for whatever level of the recall it happens to be? But how do we make the right people know faster, so that the supply can be identified and removed, and avoid any potential downstream impact or risk to our patients, first and foremost. But the other piece, and kind of boiling it backwards, is around the whole communication piece. Is how do we communicate that recall even exists? And so, looking at current process, which tends to be very manual, and it's a henpeck. I look for a supply, and do we have it? Do we not have it? Have we ordered it? Have we not ordered it? And future process being, well, I know what I've ordered. I know what exists in inventory. I know when it was last used. I know all of these details, right down to the handheld, to know that if it happens to be a stock item in our inventory, knowing that if I'm picking that supply out of a bin and I have a notice that shows up on my handheld device that says this item has shown up on a recall notice, providing that visibility to your frontline, central supply tech, to maybe just even ask the question. I'm a huge proponent of ask the whys, ask the questions. And so you need to know that there's a question to ask. And so that piece would really see benefit in that. And then there's other things that we've been working on currently. So while recall management is a work in progress that we have yet to deploy, but we've been working on the implementation. Another one that we have deployed and we are leveraging is around our item data cleansing. So we've partnered with another business partner of Infor, and we go through and make sure that our item data is good, it's consistent. Do we have the right part numbers? Do we have the right descriptions? And alluding back to a comment I think Susan you had made earlier around the clinical descriptions, that's part of it. Is there's going to be a supply description that makes sense to your materials management team, but there's going to be a description that is really more clinically based. And so how do we combine the two? How do we make this so that both worlds, if you will, we live in the one world, but how do those two individual worlds, when they intersect, how do they know that they're talking about the same widget? It shouldn't take anybody to decipher or take an encyclopedia or a dictionary to say, well, is this a Foley catheter? Yes or no. It should be a Foley catheter regardless of who you're speaking with. The clinical side needs additional detail that maybe the material side doesn't. And so working to address that. But on top of that is, adding in additional details like the GTIN, our UDI data. FDA is continuing to require and mandate around GTINs and making sure that everybody's got that documented. And so the GTIN really drives a number of benefits beyond just your supply management, but it also benefits your clinical systems. So Infor for us is a base system, and we send our data over to our Epic system, and Expert for Cath Lab, and Cupid under Epic, and other systems, right? And so it is critical that we've got as much of that information available for those systems for the purpose of scanning the product. And so whether the product is being scanned at the patient bedside or if it's being scanned in the OR for the purpose of documentation and billing, that GTIN data element is critical. And even all the way down to kind of a future state wish list conversation still is around, how do we integrate with preference cards? How do we make sure that our preference cards are being maintained for our pick lists, so that as our physician preferred items, when they're being picked for a case, that they've got the items available for use, and that there isn't any inherent knowledge that's just being managed by an individual, but we actually can maintain it as a system. And regardless if Bob starts tomorrow with the organization, Bob knows that he's going to have the right information and the right access and the right supplies on day one.
I mean, the future means we're going to have a lot of work to do, and just that list makes it exciting. And to roll up the sleeves and kind of see what's next. Kurt, as you mentioned pick lists, my mind went to our clinicians again, because really this is where we're going to see the need in the future. Susan, I'm going to ask you next. We're tossing the crystal ball. We're making our best and guess from your perspective. What's the future in supply chains? What's next? What do we need to do better?
I think embracing technology is the opportunity and a challenge. There's so much technology that we use today. We barcode scan. We scan the barcodes with a handheld scanner for the inventory. But the nurses also, like Kirk talked about in the supply room, have another barcode scanner that they can scan the supply and associate to a patient's record when it's a chargeable item. And in the operating room, that's even more prevalent in preference cards. And keeping those preference cards up to date, which can be an labor-intensive opportunity, but it's important because you want those you need to document those supplies used for that patient in the clinical charting. But that then needs to flow over to the N4 system or your ERP system or your inventory management system. So it automatically decrements that inventory so that no one has to go do physical counts anymore. You have this technology that says you use this many widgets, you now need to resupply these many widgets from that pick list that your materials management person now used because they got an electronic notification that your supplies need to be replenished. I think embracing that technology, there's RFID technology that Steve showed on his screen. There's technology with smart speaker devices like Alexa and other things like that. And I say Siri and my iPhone will go off, so I won't say that too loud. I think it's hard for clinicians to always embrace technology, but as the workforce gets younger and younger in the clinical world, they want more technology in their world, but it involves that engagement and the extra work that you talked about.
I think automation is certainly going to be the hurdle that we continue to climb over as we look to the future. John, your crystal ball, what do the R's look like? What do they require? What are they going to incorporate as we go forward?
Well, this conversation has been great. And I think what's so nice about this conversation is it's personal to everybody, right? We want to make sure when we take our loved one into a clinical setting that they're going to get the best care as possible. And we want those care workers to be focused on delivering that care. I think what we're going to see is more focus on trying to figure out how do we automate some of these data capture, activities so that we can focus more attention to patient care. And what we're finding is there's a lot of regulations happening. I think Kurt mentioned FDA around, device, UDI, the Drug Supply Chain Security Act, where we're tracing sellable units all the way from medication, all the way from the manufacturer, all the way to the dispenser. So I think those are the disruptors in the industry that are going to be enabling us to take that step forward and look at how do we work with manufacturers to get supplies and pharmaceuticals and even devices have an RFID tag on them so that, we can sense where those things are. I mean, the technology exists right now for us to be able to do that today. And I think it's just a matter of, we've been talking, how do we get the right players at the table and, kind of talk through this and figure out, the win-win for everybody. But I certainly think that's where we're heading. I mean, I remember when I was a 19-year-old kid in the Air Force, I was working at the midnight shift, and I had to go into that par level closet and I had to count things, and I did okay. I was a 19-year-old kid, but checking expiration dates and, lot codes and all that stuff, yeah, not so much. So imagine, being able to do that. So I have a sensor that knows when a product went in or out of those par level closets, and I can automatically decrement and trigger resupplies, or being able to tell somebody, hey, there's something that's going to expire in 2 or 3 weeks. Why don't you put that to the beginning? Or like you said, Kurt, the recalls, systemically knowing where everything is and be able to trigger those events where we pull those off the shelf, and we're not pulling off all of the French catheters. We're surgically, I'm going to kind of use a healthcare term, we're surgically just be able to find where those specific items are that are affected, and not just take a big swoop and take everything off in fear of, infecting or having an adverse reaction. So I think the future's bright. I don't think we're too far from that. I think it's just a matter of, again, just connecting the dots. So.
We spend a lot of time in healthcare right now talking about how we reduce burden, and particularly how do we reduce burden on our clinicians. As we're sitting here, that's where my mind's starting to go is, whether it's documentation burden, some of the task burden of having to count or stock. The future has some great opportunity here and to make an impact and make sure that our clinicians and the entirety of workforce are spending time where it's most valuable to them and their job responsibilities. Steve, crystal ball is yours. Where are we going? What do we need to do in supply chain?
I love the imagery of John in the par closet. We Yeah, I'm going to double down on John's answer and just add a nuance to it. We get a lot of inquiries around automating supply chain replenishment, right? Those are man people hours in doing those things, right? And whether it's we want real-time updates of the status of the supplies, or if it's, you know what, once a day, twice a day, 3 times a day, anything that eliminates steps, right? And people hours that could otherwise be just taking care of the health of the patient, right? So there are a few different ways to achieve that. We have seen some really nice traction on the RFID side as it relates to automating the supply replenishment. So exciting stuff coming there.
All right. Well, and I guess this is a bit of a stay tuned at this point, and we'll have to reconvene and see, whose crystal ball was really clear. Were there clouds somewhere? What were we missing? I want to thank you all for your contributions here, but we're not done yet. So this is to the audience. We want to turn this to some open question and answer, and we're starting to get some in the chat, so maybe kick it off there. But please, if you're in the audience and you've got questions for our panelists here, please submit them now. But to kick us off on some of the questions that are in, there's one question here, and I realized that we talked about starting your project in 2019, but we didn't talk about its entirety. How long this entire project take? Kurt, can I toss that one to you perhaps?
Yeah, you bet. How long did the project take? That is a fantastic question, because the project is just never ending, right? And so there's implementations and making sure our hospitals go live, and so focusing the answer on that piece. It began July 1st of 2019 was our initial go live site. But the project, I'll say, officially, unofficially concluded in 2021 with the last of our scheduled ministries. Is probably the best way to make that statement. Christus continues to expand and grow and transition, and so when I say that it doesn't ever really end, I don't believe in my heart of hearts that this will ever end, right? And that's the part that makes this job fun. Is we get to be part of something that's ever growing, it's ever changing and evolving. So technically 21, but really forever and always, I anticipate.
That's the exciting part. So this really is a stay tuned. This is a continued conversation. Thank you. Now, there's a few others in there, and there was a question about unforeseen obstacles. I think we talked through some of those gotchas and the loopholes that you faced, and well, we kind of alluded to hindsight, and it is always better. But if you had another chance, if you were using your crystal ball for the future, is there anything you'd do differently? Either how you've done it or what you do differently? And Kurt or Susan, I would love to hear from you on that.
Yeah, so I'll start. Oh man alive, there's probably too many things on this one. Again, I think this turns into a counseling session if I were to think about it too long. So I think one of them would really be around understanding what's going to happen on some of our things. So as far as dependencies, I referred earlier to Infor being a platform. It's a base for our data, and other systems are dependent upon that data. One of which is Epic. And so when we started implementing Epic in 2021, as far as interfacing it with Infor, at least, there were some resulting challenges that came out of that. We didn't know, we didn't understand that the challenge was about to occur. And so as a result, ended up having a lot of meetings, last minute meetings, and trying to determine how do we resolve this, what's causing it, Infor on the phone, Epic on the phone, revenue integrity on the phone, my team on the phone, supply chain on the phone. And so there was just we thought everything would work because everything looked good. But when you start looking in mass volumes, that's when things start to show up. So I might have 100,000 lines of data, and there might be 1,000 that are disparate. But if we happen to have looked at the other 99,000, we looked great. And so, that was certainly a huge unforeseen issue, and is now since, as we've got processes to help manage and mitigate it. But I think that was probably one of the biggest ones, at least recent big ones.
And maybe this ties into this. We've had another question come in, and the question states, how do you account for lost assets? This audience member has worked on numerous hospital starts as a project project manager, they've had to rely on multiple departments and discussions with those who could supply information and would be accountable. So from a Christus perspective, how do you account for lost assets?
So you're referring to, and I'm not going to be a finance person in this, so I will preface that. So by lost assets, I'll read that as lost supplies. So, we take an adjustment. I'm expecting to have 10 on the shelf and I've got 0. Where did my supply go to? And so really that is, what do I say? The foundation of the answer, I think, really goes back to that whole communication, like what is being communicated and what's showing up. Ultimately we end up taking an adjustment off, and the adjustment may be correct, it may be incorrect. We do annual physical inventories on our larger core supply areas like our OR, our cath lab, procedural areas. And so sometimes that gets right sized, within the same year, but other times it doesn't. And I've personally witnessed as an interim director at one of our hospitals some years ago, supply was bone cement. I'll never forget it. It just would keep on going off the shelf. It would disappear. And so it got to the point where it was twice a day cycle counts on that specific supply to determine where is this disappearing to, right? And so end of day, the resolution working with the peri-op director was to put that under dual custody, lock and key. And I can tell you that, prior to that, it would go through and disappear. We'd replenish, disappear, putting under the dual custody. While I don't advocate for that as a solution, but there was never a way to identify who was doing what or where it was going. And after that point, we never had an issue again. And so I think there's sometimes you have to be flexible, and as much as you put processes and controls in place, the technology, Susan, kind of stealing your point earlier, the technology assists, but it doesn't provide a solution for everything. People will find things to do or workarounds, and so ultimately we take it as an adjustment. It hits our bottom line end of day because we can't account for it. It's lost revenue, but yeah, it's just one of those pieces of managing supply.
You said the word flexible, and I appreciate that answer. And it clearly you have to use some ingenuity in solving those challenging situations. And Susan, you did talk a little earlier about a time where ingenuity and flexibility pushed us to our limits, and it was during the pandemic. And we do have a question here, and this will be our last question, but I think we have to answer this one. I want to make sure we get it in. You shared a little about what you did during the pandemic, but I am curious, how did the pandemic impact your project? And maybe Susan, if you want to start, since you shared a little bit, and then and Kurt, if you want to wrap us up after that too.
Well, I think it impacted us because we had to think outside the box. We had processes in place and technology in place, and we had the system built and the application, but it didn't matter. It was vaporware, it didn't matter. You no longer could get supplies from that vendor that you wanted to get supplies for because they had no workforce. And even if you could get the supply, how are you going to get it shipped? They had no workforce. I mean, no one could drive anywhere, no one could fly anywhere, no one could shop. Amazon wasn't delivering. It impacted everything. We got real creative. And some of the lessons learned from that have had us evolve into new things that we never did before that we still do now for basically emergency preparedness. Inventory control is just-in-time ordering in most hospital systems. It makes sense to do just-in-time ordering instead of having shelves stocked with items that, you have to rotate first in, first out, very manual intensive. Just-in-time ordering, you have to look at it now a little bit different. Do you want to do just-in-time ordering for this item or only that item? Item A or item B? Which do you want to keep as just-in-time ordering, and which do you want to have a small inventory set aside just for emergency preparedness? Because we're just another pandemic away from learning another lesson that was difficult. And I was thinking about the crystal ball, and I just want to reset one more thing on the crystal ball that I think is important as I was listening to everybody talk. And it's the first time I think I've mentioned it in our talks, and that's predictive analytics. That's the opportunity that technology is going to provide for our clinicians. capturing that data electronically. It's going to allow for predictive analytics, capturing your census, capturing your schedule for your cath lab and your OR, using predictive analytics to have supplies in advance of what you have coming tomorrow. Using that predictive analytics data to say, this is what you need tomorrow, so that your staff doesn't have to manually start using pick list and ordering stuff from a preference card to have it picked and in their carts ready to use at the operating room. Charting those items on that electronic medical record, whatever that is. Predictive analytics is a feature that I think clinicians need to embrace if they haven't yet.
Susan, I honestly can't think of a better place to press pause, which I hate to do at this, but we are out of time. I just think right there, you've said it. We've got a lot of work to do. You've shared with us here your exemplary approach to building the foundation to be prepared for really what is the unknown. And in doing so, not only optimize your supply chain workforces, but truly better the working conditions for your clinicians and in turn create a stronger, more valuable patient experience. I really appreciate the dialogue today. I hope it sparked ideas and curiosity, or maybe created more questions for our audience today. As I shared earlier, this session has been recorded. You will receive it in your email, and with that, you'll also receive contact information for our panel of experts. So we hope to hear from you. To the panel here, thank you for your time and your expertise. I look forward to meeting with you all again and seeing what happens in the future.
Thanks, Ricky. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.